sewing project and thought something might be missing? It's probably this. This is the difference between an okay project and a project made by a pro. Top stitching. So what is top stitching? Top stitching is a row of stitches that you create on the top side of a fabric, so on the right side of the fabric. You can use a color thread that blends into your fabric, or you can use a contrast thread just to create a statement. There is also thread that is specific for top stitching, and it is a little thicker in nature. When you're using two different thicknesses of thread, you may need to want to play with your tension dial a bit in order to balance the stitches out. Always test on a scrap piece of fabric first, and this scrap piece of fabric needs to mimic the same area that you are going to top stitch on your actual project. So why should you top stitch your project? Top stitching is used to reinforce seams, to give them strength to withhold all the stress that they are going to be put through their life, such as jeans or the top of patch pockets. Top stitching is also used to hold seams down and out of the way and give your project a neater look on areas such as the tops of bags by a zipper. Another reason to top stitch is just purely decorative. You can use top stitching just to add some extra details to whatever project you are working on. So let's have a look now at how we sew it. First, you are going to need two pieces of fabric, and we are going to put them right sides together, so pretty sides together, and we are going to sew a seam first. Today I'm just going to use a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, and how I see that is on my needle plate I will just look for the 3/8 of an inch mark. I will put the raw edge of my fabric up against that, and then I will just sew straight all the way down. At the beginning and end of my stitches, I have just backstitch, which is just a way to make sure that your stitches don't come undone. Now on the underside of my fabric, I'm going to press the seam towards one side with a hot iron. This allows the stitches to be set, and as well it will keep that seam in its place. Then we are going to flip it to the right side, so we have now the right side of our fabric facing up. Now because we have our fabric covering our needle plate, we can't actually see the measurements that we can always keep at a same distance from the seam, so we are going to have to use a focal point on our foot to keep us in line. So I know that on my presser foot I have this little mark over here, and this is my 1/4 inch mark. So I am going to align the edge of my seam with that 1/4 inch mark, and then I'm going to lower my needle into my fabric. Before you start stitching, make sure that you lengthen your stitch length to anywhere between a 3 and a 4, because this longer stitch length is just going to make your row of stitches look a lot neater. So I am lowering my presser foot, and my seam allowance is a 1/4 inch. So I'm aligning the edge of my seam with my 1/4 inch mark on my foot. You can use an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance or 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, whatever your pattern is calling for. Or if you are designing your own project, you decide on what the distance you want your top stitching to be at. This is what the top stitching looks like from the right side of the fabric. And this is what it looks like from the underside of the fabric. So this row over here was the first row of stitches that we used to join the two pieces of fabric together, and this second row over here is our top stitching row. If you are beginning the top stitch in an area where that seam is still going to be closed with another row of stitches at a later step, you don't need to backstitch at the beginning or at the end if that is the case. Alternatively, if it is an area that you are not going to enclose within another seam, you can pull these stitches to the underside and you can tie them together instead of creating that bulk on the exterior of the fabric. And by tying them on the outside, you will have a neater finish on the top side of your fabric. Another option for top stitching, instead of just top stitching one row, you can top stitch 2 rows, and this will just reinforce your seams that extra bit, but also give it just that extra little bit of decoration. So to demonstrate that to you now, I am going to use an 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, and again on my presser foot I know that this little mark over here is an 1/8 of an inch distance from my needle. So I am going to align the edge, so where my seam is, I'm going to align it with that mark on my presser foot, lower the needle down into my fabric, lower the presser foot, and I am going to sew. And this is what 2 rows of top stitching looks like. It just gives your project a little bit of extra something to look at. Top stitching doesn't just have to be in straight lines. Some makes and models of sewing machines have extra stitches on them for decorative purposes, and this is what some of them look like over here. But we can leave that for another day. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel, and that's it from me today. Bye for now.